this is probably going to be one of the last videos I do on this channel, or at least one of the last big ones. I may do some small ones in the future, but they'll be far and few between. And this is basically because I've said just about everything I wanted to say. And this particular video will be about the documentary hypothesis. And this is something that all Christians should be aware of. They should know what it is. Whether you agree with it or not, you should know what it is. Because almost every major theologian believes in some form of the documentary hypothesis. So we're going to learn about that today, or at least the basics of it. When I was in junior high school during the early 70s, I used to always read one chapter of my Bible every night before bed. And one night I noticed something very odd. I was reading Genesis 20, and it told about how Abraham and his wife Sarah were traveling through a land called Gerar. And Abraham instructed Sarah to tell the people in this place that she was his sister. Now he did this because she was supposedly a very beautiful woman, and he feared that some man might come and, maybe murder him in the night and then take his wife. The strange thing was that I had just read something very similar a few nights earlier in Genesis 12. Only that time they had been traveling through Egypt, and once again Sarah had said that she was the sister of Abraham, and for the same reason. However, in Genesis 20, Abraham explains that when they had first left his father's house, way back when, and began to wonder, that he had already asked Sarah then to say everywhere they went that they were brother and sister. So apparently this was to be a regular motif during their wanderings. However, a few chapters later in Genesis 26, we find Abraham's son Isaac traveling with his wife through the exact same land of Gerar, and it is still ruled by the same king, Abimelech, or a son of the king who took on his father's name. And Isaac pulls the exact same stunt, asking his beautiful wife to tell the people that she is his sister. Now one might conclude that Isaac had simply learned from his father's ways. However, it still seemed very strange to read what seemed like the same story, only slightly changed 3 times in the span of 16 chapters in the same book. I was too young to know it at the time, but I later learned that this repetition of the same story in the Bible is known as a triplet, or a doublet if told twice, and that doublets and triplets appear quite often in the Bible. Now this triplet seemed harmless enough and fairly explainable, but others can often be very contradictory. We have 2 creation stories in different chapters that are a little off, 2 flood stories intertwined that are very much at odds, and 2 stories of the 10 Commandments, well, actually more like 3, that are again similar but different in small details. The famous 19th century Bible scholar Julius Wellhausen noticed something very surprising when he began to study the doublets and triplets in detail. The separate stories more often than not referred to God by a different name, and had a slightly different writing style. This led him to conclude that the stories, though very similar, came from different sources and were later woven together by a very skillful editor, which he referred to as a redactor. In Genesis 1, we find a story of the creation of the world. Genesis 2 and part of Genesis 3 retell that story, only slightly different. In Genesis 1, God created all the vegetation on the 3rd day, and then he created both man and woman on the 6th day after everything else. In Genesis 2:4, it starts out recounting everything, saying, "This is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created. When the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, and no shrub of the field had yet appeared on the earth, and no plant of the field had yet sprung up. For the Lord God had not sent rain on the earth, and there was no man to work the ground. But streams came up from the earth and watered the whole surface of the ground. The Lord God formed the man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being." So man is created before the vegetation and even before the animals. Woman, however, is not created until much later in verse 21. Further, and perhaps more importantly, the story in Genesis 1 always refers to the Creator as Elohim, or the shortened version El, 35 times in fact. In the Genesis 2 creation story, all 11 times the Creator is mentioned, he is named as Yahweh. So right away we have this bit of a mystery. We, for some strange reason, have an account of the creation of the world, and immediately thereafter have another account of the creation of the world, which is slightly different and which calls God by a different name. In Genesis 6, we find a very odd account of the story of Noah and the flood. It starts out in verse 5 with God lamenting over all the evil that humans had done the earth over. The Lord God saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. The Lord was grieved that he had made man on the earth, and his heart was filled with pain. So the Lord said, I will wipe mankind, whom I have created, from the face of the earth, men and animals. Now starting in verse 11, God repeats himself in slightly different terms. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. So God said to Noah, I am going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. It's very redundant, but the redundancy hardly ends there. Between verses 9 and 22, we get what seems a complete account of God grieving over creation, him telling Noah to build an ark and what creatures to take into it, and how he will destroy the whole earth in a flood. Verse 22 sounds like the end of the story, saying, Noah did everything just as God commanded him. However, Genesis 7 seems to begin the story all over again, once again telling Noah what kind of animals to take into the ark. Then he says in verse 6, Noah was 600 years old when the floodwaters came on the earth. And Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives entered the ark to escape the waters of the flood. Pairs of clean and unclean animals, of birds, and of all creatures that move along the ground, male and female, came to Noah and entered the ark, as God had commanded Noah. After the 7 days, the floodwaters came on the earth. But beginning in verse 11, it restates everything it just said, again slightly different. In the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the 2nd month, on that day all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened, and rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. On that very day Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, together with his wife and the wives of his 3 sons, entered the ark. They had with them every wild animal according to its kind, all livestock according to their kinds. If you read through the entire flood account, you will quickly see how redundant the entire flood story is, constantly saying everything twice, but each time a little differently. In fact, it's very easy to separate the verses in such a way as to have 2 entire accounts of the flood. They would be as follows. I'm just going to show this on the screen to show you which verses from which chapters would be in the first account. You might want to, pause this and write them down. And now we'll show you the second account and the chapter and verses involved with it. And again, you might want to write them down.